Thanks for coming. It's a great honour to have been asked to give this year's Kevin Lynch Memorial Lecture, and a special honour to be doing so on behalf of Bill Hillier, who can't be here this evening. Bill is recovering from breaking his leg, but he sends his best wishes, and I know he wants to be here. He and I have spoken by Skype to prepare for this. He's written part of it. I'm going to fill in a few gaps, and together we want to focus on the past a little bit, but especially what's happening currently and what we plan to happen in the future with space syntax. And I'm not going to be able to do justice in the time available to the breadth and the depth of Bill's genius. And I use the word genius carefully because I think Bill is a genius. He's one of the few that we could truly hold at that level. And this evening I may only touch on concepts that each deserve a good deal more time to explain and to discuss. And equally, I can only mention a few of many hundreds, if not thousands, of projects that Bill and his colleagues at Space Syntax have helped to create, be part of over the past 4 decades or so. Some of us are in the room this evening. Thanks for being here, Eduardo, Biliana, and maybe a few others that have been part of the process. But what I do hope I will do is paint a picture of Bill's achievement, albeit a personal one. You may have your own version of it. I'm going to give mine. I want to talk especially about the future, though, because the future is important. Bill's not obviously sentimental. He's far more likely to want to talk about something he's currently working on than something he's done in the past, something he doesn't yet understand as much more interesting. He hasn't ever, to my knowledge, sought prizes, but he's enjoyed them when they've appeared, and I know the Lifetime Achievement Award was certainly one that mattered. But maybe like other recipients of the award, he wondered why it was being given so soon. When I spoke with him last weekend, he explained what he'd really like to be talking about this evening is what he's currently working on. But it's often the case with emerging thinking. He's not quite sure he's right about it. In other words, there's more to be done. But he was keen to shape this evening, and therefore I want to begin with a few words from Bill. And in summary, he says, how we design cities is how we understand them. And goes on to say, by understanding, we mean having some kind of mental model linking the physical and spatial patterns that make up the city to how they are experienced by people and how they work for them. And this may involve spatial ideas, for example, about the relation between local neighbourhoods and the city as a whole, and functional ideas, for example, about how and where active centres and sub-centres can be located. Whatever its source, he says, we can think of this as a structure-function model. And it will tell us, rightly or wrongly, that if we design the space of the city in this way, rather than that, then it will change how the city is experienced and how it works. And I know he was very pleased and excited to say Kevin Lynch took the question of such a model in the direction of science by bringing to light 5 spatial and physical concepts through which people describe the cities they saw in Lynch's work: paths, edges, districts, nodes and landmarks. And as Lynch acknowledged, these are not independent of each other. For example, edges will normally be the edges of districts, and nodes will be the meeting of paths, nor are there argued to be general principles of how the concepts relate to each other to form the city as a whole, other than to exploit these interdependencies. In fact, and this is where, speaking to Bill, he got very excited, from the point of view of the city as a whole, there's a remarkably interesting proposition in the image of the city, which is when Lynch says here, the paths, the network of habitual or potential lines of movement through the urban complex, are the most potent means by which the whole can be ordered. And I think Bill thought he'd written that. I think that's why he was so excited. Such a connection. Bill goes on to say, compared with this network, Lynch adds, the edges, districts, nodes and landmarks are the design of other elements. The form of the city and the interrelating of the five elements arises from how the network of paths is constructed. So the priority of this path network, Lynch's path network in cities, is shared by space syntax in its attempt to take the question further in the direction of science by testing spatial forms against observable functions rather than just human descriptions. This is still Bill speaking, putting his work in the context of Lynch's. So whereas Lynch was talking to people, what Bill and we have been doing is also observing people, observing and gathering data. Bill says, space syntax argues that many of the key concepts for understanding the city as a spatial and functional system can be derived from the analysis of the street network. The research question posed by space syntax is there a formal procedure to describe the spatial structure of the city which both captures its characteristic spatial forms and maps observable functional patterns with enough rigour to test the link between the two, between form and function. And that this turns out to be the case, that you can do this, is due to the fact, Bill says, that the procedure brings to light a fundamental relation between the spatial structure of the city and its functioning. That, other things being equal, the key determinant of movement in the lines that make up the city is the spatial configuration itself, how each line relates to all the others. We call this phenomenon of the degree to which movement is shaped by the urban grid the law of natural movement. It generally underlies many structural phenomena which are common to most, if not all, cities. I think if Bill were being less modest, he would say all cities work according to natural movement, and all towns and all villages and all insides of buildings. But these are his words, not my interpretation for the moment. Bill goes on to say, through this fundamental law of natural movement, the procedure can, in scientific terms, lead from a structure-function model to a testable structure-function theory of the city, one which could serve both our increasing need for scientific understanding of the city in terms of its economic and social performance, and as a model for use in design. The procedure of space syntax generates a set of memorable concepts which summarize the syntactic structure-function theory of the city as far as it has so far been developed, and can be used to define the theory, as Lynch's 5 concepts define the view of the city that emerged from his research. Finally, Bill says, understand these concepts and you understand space syntax. So, this is the bit where I take over. Let me, in one slide, try to explain the 5 key concepts that underpins space syntax. I'm going to do it without changing slide, without showing you any fancy graphics, because it's the concepts that matter. The computation comes next, but it's the concepts that are the foundation. I've got a bit to say about them. This is going to be the slide that stays on the screen longest, so you can pitch everything else I'm going to do from here on in as being shorter than this slide, but it's the important one. So the first key concept is the description of space itself, that it's possible to break the apparent chaos and complexity of the city into discrete elements that can be the subject of computational analysis. In most space syntax analysis, the discrete element is the road centre line between one street intersection and the next. It's really that simple. The street element between one intersection and the next is what we compute. It has a length, it has an orientation, north-south, west-east, some angle in between, length and orientation. And then at one end it may have no other connections if it's a cul-de-sac, or at the other end it might have many if it's a circus. It might just have three more if it's a typical two-way intersection. These are all very simple numeric concepts that allow you to build a mathematics of space. And along it, it'll have a number of buildings or other spatial elements. Those buildings will have a size and a use. You can attach measures of attraction, measures of capacity to everything along the street. So you can measure space. That's the first key concept that space syntax offers. You can define the chaos. Secondly, and most importantly, as Bill has already mentioned, is the theory of natural movement, which demonstrates that the more connected streets are better used. Connectivity is measured using a computer algorithm. It's beyond the ability of the human brain to measure all of the connectivity in even a moderately sized spatial system. So we use algorithms. And what they do is they measure how likely it is, for example, that people will want to flow down any particular street in the city as they move from A to B. The algorithm calculates all possible journeys using not only the distance of the journey as an input, but also the complexity of the journey. And this is the USP of space syntax. Most traffic models, very many other spatial models, don't include complexity. And as a result, they don't work particularly well to describe real human behavior. What the space syntax algorithms have been written to do is to acknowledge the way the brain thinks in navigational terms. That when we compute how we're going to get to somewhere, we think not only of the distance it is, but how easily, geometrically, we can make that journey. Most people, most of the time, take the route that involves the least angular deviation from origin to destination. Some of us wander and don't. Maybe the urban design group is a group of wanderers. But most people, most of the time, take the cognitively simplest journey. It means our brains have to think less about navigation. By implication, I think it means our brains can think more about what we're seeing, who we're seeing, what we're saying, what we're thinking. It's a way of minimizing the processing of the brain to take the simplest route from A to B. It's not what I was taught as an architect, though. I don't know about you in the room. I was taught to wander, and I was taught that everybody else was doing that. Follow a few people, you discover otherwise. I'll come on to that later. This has been discovered and proven, if you like, the link between connectivity and movement thousands of times now, over a couple of decades. It's no longer a question. For me, actually, it's one of the most important discoveries in science. If there were a Nobel Prize for urban design, and there may yet be one, I think Bill would win it. The third concept describes cities as movement economies. In other words, it explains how land uses in the city arrange themselves to take advantage of the natural movement pattern. The shops move to the more connected streets with more natural movement, and the houses move, in the majority, to the side and the back streets. The fourth concept of the simultaneously multi-scale city adds a fundamental description of human life in cities, which is that activity you see on any street is typically a mix of people moving across longer and shorter journeys. The proportion of longer to shorter journeys may vary from the more connected to the less connected streets, but it is always to a degree there. Multi-scale movement and the human interactions that are induced by this are fundamental to trade, to both social and economic transaction. One of the shortcomings of modern planning has been to overly separate global and local movement. I'll come back to this later in the talk. We've not done the multi-scale thing very well. I think it has implications for the integration of new people into existing places as well, which we might come into under discussion. Fifth and finally, the concept of the dual grid provides a definition of the purpose of cities. It allows us to distinguish for any scale of movement between the foreground grid of the main routes and the background grid of the minor routes. This is so important a concept. I'm going to quote Bill directly again, that I can't get it wrong. Finally, he says, space in cities works in more than one way. The foreground network is structured to maximize movement, and it is so because it is driven by microeconomic factors which benefit from high levels of movement, while the background network restricts and structures movement, and does so because it is driven by social and cultural factors which find expression in the way residential space is structured. So the dual network in cities reflects functional as well as spatial processes. This is an instance, Bill says, of the more general potential of space to operate in two ways. Space can be used generatively to create new patterns of movement, and so co-presence and potential relations in the social system, or it can be used conservatively to express and so reproduce existing social patterns and structures. The former is associated with spatial integration, the latter with spatial segregation. The former with the foreground grid, the latter with the background grid. The difference between the foreground and background grids is the difference between morphogenetic and more conservative space. The former, morphogenetic, focuses movement to create development and change. The latter diffuses it to keep things as they are. This generic structure seems to underlie all cities in some sense and to some degree, and we must conclude that beneath the individuality and cultural typing of cities, there is a universal, generic city which makes the city what essentially it is. All societies must in some sense be morphogenetic in order to cope with changing technological and social circumstances. And all societies must also act in ways that reproduce their structures, hence the dual use of space. Cities are spatially massive, morphogenetic machines that produce change, set into a conservative background which stabilizes their structure. This is the generic city. It was, I believe, says Bill, the discovery of the generic city that first made urban societies possible. And personally, I think that's brilliant. We're simultaneously coping with change while reproducing ourselves enough that it doesn't feel like chaos. And that is how we deal with technological change, societal change, demographic change, continuously and simultaneously conserving and producing. No other slide will be that long. At the heart of the space syntax approach is actually a very simple desire for thriving life and societal stability, therefore. This is me speaking now. Plenty of action on the foreground grid of main streets and in the centres, social and economic interaction, transaction and innovation. And then quiet repose in the background of mainly residential streets. And if we can look beyond the clever computation that often accompanies space syntax, what matters is thriving life. However, this is where I'm going to be a bit self-critical. In many space syntax presentations, I don't know about you, but there's a wash of technical analysis which has sometimes obscured the key cultural messages. There's too many graphs, too few statements of fundamental so therefore importance, which I think is forgivable in a young discipline trying to find its way in a hostile context, thinking of the 1980s, confronted at every turn by the architectural establishment, by the Home Office, by transport planners, not by urban designers, not at all. Far from it. And it's far easier in those kinds of circumstances to withdraw and to talk a secret language of the clique rather than the common language of the crowd. I think it's also understandable that in academic circles, space syntax needs a certain esoteric scientific rigour of debate. But the discipline is no longer in its early years or even its teenage years. And the needs of cities are more than academic. And so I believe space syntax is mature now. And it needs to behave that way. The context is no longer hostile to the discussions of space, connectivity, place, people, walking, active frontages. The 80s and 90s are no more. And in an increasingly urbanising world, in which car-centric paradigms still dominate, despite all our efforts, science is needed, I believe, more than ever to make sense of the pace of change, which is an increasing pace of change in global urbanism. And as one of the few scientific attempts in urban design to explain cities, space syntax needs to work even harder to have its voice heard. And if you think this is any kind of criticism of Bill, far from it. There's been no better person, in my experience, at presenting space syntax to a non-academic audience than Bill. Go and watch his piece for Tomorrow's World. If you Google it or YouTube it, Tomorrow's World 1993, discussing spatial connections with a group of residents who understood exactly what he was saying, who understood that not all upper-level walkways were automatically bad. And in many ways, Bill developed space syntax for these communities. Space syntax was accelerated through engagement like this at Limehouse Basin in the early 1980s, shortly afterwards at Coin Street, and standing up to developments that were recognised locally as being wrong for people, wrong for local communities, providing, as Bill did, the evidence of science to build a better case for those communities to object. And then later, not only to object, but to propose, to help design places for people, but to do it with the developers, with the architects, not against them in public inquiries. And since then, space syntax has been involved in some of the most important projects in the UK, such as the redesign of Trafalgar Square. I know it's been spoken about by Peter Heath at one of these events before. where what we did was to explain the old design of Trafalgar Square didn't work. First through observation, then through the construction of a spatial model that explained why people walked around the edges of the square, because the routes through the middle were much more spatially dislocated. It was much more convenient just to walk slightly further around the outside. And this diagnosis produced a creative idea from Bill to build a new staircase in the centre of the square. The modelling showed how this bottom left would have a major positive impact on pedestrian flows. Hot red lines through the middle of the square. And Bill shared this idea in a project review with Norman Foster, and Norman and the team accepted it. It was delivered, it was built, and of all the architects we've worked with, I think Norman Foster seems to understand space syntax the best. Not that there's a competition, but it's interesting that he says, I know these techniques work from the tough environment of practice. I love the world of analysis, observation, of research, but also passion, imprecision, the hunch. Space syntax is the testing of the interaction of these opposing worlds. And he couldn't put it, no one could put it better. Space syntax is not a scientific, press the button, it will happen process. It's a means of testing ideas, anyone's ideas, from within the community, professional or non-professional. And from that dialogue emerges design. To Foster, it's not just a set of pretty, if sometimes complicated pictures to post-rationalize his preconceived design ideas. It's not a techno-wash to bamboozle the uninitiated. I've seen other people do that. Maybe you have too. It's not. It's a design tool. It mediates between the rational science and the artistic emotion. And I can say it with confidence because I've seen it firsthand working with Bill since about 1992. And currently working with Bill, with Norman Foster again, the Foster Foundation, on this project you may have seen to expand London's cycling capacity with another 500 million cycle journeys a year by putting decks above the train tracks into central London. Not to remove cycling from street level, as has been cynically assumed by people who never spoke to us, but actually to add to it, to make London more cycle friendly. And to create opportunities to connect across the tracks and make London work even harder. Those tracks often divide. How can they better connect? So whether at that fine scale of Trafalgar Square or Broadgate or Old Market Square in Nottingham, a project that Biliana was very closely involved in, or the large scale of Sky Cycle, space syntax was conceived as a tool to facilitate design, to take the guesswork out of it. And as a young architecture student, I thought, why wouldn't I want that? I think it's fair to say that much of what we've done has been behind the scenes, as helping in the creation of the Queen Elizabeth Park for the London Olympic and Paralympic Games, where what we did was to shape the design of the Olympic Park master plan so that it made connections, better connections with those communities to the west and east of it. And this means the park remains today an active part of the city. In London and many other places, the space syntax approach has been used on a wide range of projects, including, and I quite love it, the humble pedestrian crossing. Why shouldn't we make these things even better, or much better, than they currently are? Sometimes more prominently, such as here in Darwin, in the Northern Territory, Australia, where we worked with the Lord Mayor and her team of advisors, including people like Oxford Brookes educated Steve Thorne, the diaspora of UK education, to create a plan that doubles the size of that city in a way that will create new street-based urbanism with enhanced land values. We went through a master plan process of many design workshops, community consultations, and during this we ran the model live to fine-tune create a grid to connect the existing city on the left with the new extension of the city to the right. We produced the final master plan and inked in the buildings based on a network of streets and spaces that integrate the new with the old, but always analysing it to make sure that strong connections were being made into and through the new development, but also some quieter, less well-connected streets too. In this way, a hierarchy of connections, the foreground and the background grid being created, and also that the existing city centre would remain active. It wouldn't have its life drawn away, as often has been the case as cities have expanded. Their centres have moved. Not in this case. We needed to keep this a city of multiple centres. Turning theory into practice and influencing policy, but also influencing investment. We built an urban value model using the analysis as a key input, using space syntax analysis to demonstrate the impact on future land values by being able to show how in the existing city the connectivity of streets was directly related to the value of buildings. We could then take the master plan, measure the connectivity in the new streets and project it into a real estate value. And I have to say that's the moment where the real estate investors in the room sit up and listen. They'll moderately be concerned with discussions of active frontages. But if you start talking to them in terms of their net present value and their internal rates of return, and stick a figure like 3.7 billion Australian dollars in front of them, they listen. And we'd never done this before. That's another factor of the process. A key lesson from practice is that it provokes research. If you organise it correctly, the studio of design can be as fertile as the research environment at a university. Not everyone in traditional academia agrees or wants to agree, but it's true. And it's one of the reasons Bill engages so closely with the consulting company, Space Syntax Limited, that does this kind of work. It's not to make money, it's to make ideas. He sees the company as his source of inspiration. But it's not to say we don't work closely with academia, far from it. For example, the UCL-led Urban Buzz project gave us an opportunity around 10 years ago to develop Bill's controversial research into burglary, to finesse his findings about the importance of spatial layout. And it's a complex explanation, not for this evening, but in summary, better connected streets, such as those on the left, can reduce, hence the minus, the lifetime costs of an area from burglary, the cost of replacing the windows, the insurance premium hikes, than disconnected layouts on the right, which increase them. But only when other factors are in place too, such as being able to see several front doors from your front door. If you like, this is putting, I think, tried and tested or intuited principles of urban design into scientific coding, so they can be replicated and, as I'll come on to later, disseminated. It's not enough for us to know this stuff. We have to embed this in policy. So armed with this kind of knowledge, we can address the UK's house building challenge, designing urban extensions that integrate with existing places. And spatial accessibility modelling provides an evidence platform to test proposals on. So we can add in the thousands of new houses and say, do they connect sufficiently? Do they connect too much? I don't need to say where it is. If anyone knows where it is, then there's no prize, just my admiration. But this is happening all over the UK. New extensions, probably not like this though, because we work really hard, folk like Paul Moraine, David Taylor, to sculpt a foreground grid in red that linked into the existing foreground grid, onto which we placed the shops, we placed the principal civic facilities, and then a background grid of quieter residential streets. High movement on those main streets, providing footfall for the shops, sufficient movement on the background grid to create that natural surveillance that Bill's previous research had shown was essential to facilitate safety. And I'm going to highlight a village where they didn't want any of this. They didn't want any new movement at all. So part of what we did was to make sure that from the existing to the new, that village barely changed at all. So we can knowingly design with movement. That's one of the great benefits of space syntax, to then bring it to discussions, stakeholder consultations, and ask people to comment. Outside the UK, elsewhere in the world, I think the challenges are different to a degree, and arguably far more important. Here we're in Jeddah in Saudi Arabia, where about a third of the population of that city lives in unplanned, informal settlements. 1/3. But if you're a wealthy car driver, you might hardly notice these people, because this is your view, your route hierarchy, calculated for journeys of about 10 kilometres. The model picking out in red those routes that are more likely to be selected by people moving at this scale. Analysis which of course can be verified by correlating the output of the spatial model with actual vehicle counts. Got to make sure the model works. And so that's the view of the driver. If I dial down the analysis, which I'm going to do next, to say, pick out for me those routes that are important if we're walking for about 5 minutes. You know, it's pretty hot in Jeddah. We might not get to 10, but let's go up to about 400, 600 meters. Those are the routes that are important. It's geometrically different at that scale. And it's a completely different set of routes than the car routes. Jeddah is 2 different cities in one, the car city and the foot city. And each of these hot-spotted places is an unplanned, informal settlement. Give people their own decision-taking ability and they build walkable communities. Give it to the planners. Certainly here in Jeddah, they build highways. Who's right? I think there's a lot for us in our profession to learn. But cities like this are cities of 2 different scales, completely 2 different worlds, are quite different to London or Paris or Vienna or Manhattan or Tokyo or many other world cities that have developed over history where local and large-scale movement coexists on the network. Remember the dual grid, where you've got local and large-scale movement coexisting. In Jeddah, no, the traffic engineers have been so successful as to render the boulevards sterile. So this diagnosis then allowed us to create redesign proposals, which were very largely about preserving within here an unplanned settlement as many of those local walkable connections as possible, widening a few in order to allow the movement of service vehicles, emergency vehicles, to allow the introduction of fresh water, the removal of waste, but not overly to do it. What then was the target was the outside of the unplanned informal settlement, where the master planning work we did was aimed at creating new connections outwards from the inside to the boulevard network, or to the highway network, slowing down the highway network to create a boulevard, reducing the design speed so that buildings could front the highways rather than back onto them, as was the current planning or the previous planning regime. And this was essentially the design concept, to turn that impenetrable ring into a collar of active frontages, so that if you live in the unplanned settlement, you could locate your market on the outside and trade to that wealthy world beyond. If you were driving past, you would be now driving at a speed where you could pull over and engage with that world. A spatially led project. But it isn't just unplanned settlements outside the UK that need spatial surgery. Closer to home, does anyone recognise where we are? A number of recently planned new towns. Anyone want to venture where we are? No prizes, no punishments? Does no one recognise this town? I'm not going to say where it is, but it's... Oh, go on. It's Christmas. No. No, it's not Bracknell. Not Milton Keynes. Not Bicester. Kind of looks like them all, though, doesn't it? I mean, isn't this terrible? This place has no distinguishing features that any of us remembers it. What have we been doing?
Can you tell us where it is?
Planned by the nation's finest minds, these new towns have recognised limitations in their spatial structures, their land use dispositions and the resulting patterns of socio-economic activity. So they've asked for help to redesign themselves.
Camborne?
Not Camborne. We're in Skelmersdale, ladies and gentlemen. Who's been to Skelmersdale? Yeah? One or two. Who's been to Darwin? In the Northern Territory? Oh, it's much more interesting. There's usually more people who've been to Darwin than to Skelmersdale. But what we're seeing here is what we have in Jeddah. It's this fundamental disconnect between the global and the local. It's the stuff that's separating the foreground main street network from the background residential street network. It's not only, and this is where I might get myself into trouble, but I know where the exit is, it's not only the highways that do this, it's the landscape. People's lives are stifled by green. And speak to people who live there and they will say this. Despite how much we might laud the creators of the new towns, who did an incredible job at the time, the product is divisive. And if there's one spatial condition that we therefore see most often at Space Syntax, it's the overly fragmented city of disconnected development. The diagram on the left. It kind of all connects, but only if you've got a car. We might soon need to say the overly disconnected corridor of garden villages. You can quote me on that. What history offers is a different model. It's the integrated city of continuously connected neighbourhoods, where you can walk between one centre and the other without ever realising you've passed from one neighbourhood to the next. Walk from Camden to Islington, between Cartier and Paris. Because the edges of those neighbourhoods are not defined by a highway or an overly wide landscape swathe, but by what Bill calls the fuzzy boundary. You know, there's one to take away, the fuzzy boundary of residential streets. Green streets, though, with trees, with hedges, with verges, but streets all the same. And this is not about environmental compromise. It's the opposite. The ecologists tell us that cities of green streets are ecologically more diverse than the countryside. So we can have our cake, we can even eat it. So we need streets, large and small, and continuously connected grids of streets with occasional, exceptional parks and open spaces, but not a patchwork quilt-like pseudo-city of disconnected areas. The key element of urban design is still a continuously connected network of streets. The 21st century should be no different to the 19th or before, but it should be very different to the 20th. I want to go next from the everyday of the urban design into some work that you may or may not have seen, slightly unconventional uses of space syntax, but I think very important ones to support the planning and design process, but not always the everyday good stuff. Some of the bad stuff, some of the emergency planning is what I want to talk about next, because it builds on a lot of Bill's early research. Space syntax is now being used in a number of these innovative ways. For example, we've used spatial layout modelling to speculate how a failure of London's flood defences, especially the Thames barrier, would impact on the large-scale movement patterns of the city. I think we all know intuitively that the loss of central London's bridge connections under that grey there on the image would devastate communications. But how precisely? And what would the new route hierarchy look like? So, modelling allows us first to identify the likely concentrations of people before the flood, where they are, and also the key movement channels in red and orange that they're likely to be taking day to day. We can always be more sophisticated, and increasingly it's almost automatic now, by loading up each of those locations with the precise land use mix and capacity, as well as the location and capacity of transport routes, bus networks, tube, train. This is all becoming incredibly easy. But in general, that sort of thing creates an autocorrelation. It turns out the law of natural movement means space alone is a pretty powerful predictor of human density. So then let's bring the water in. And when you remove those central London connections, all of that would be underwater, you can see London's movement pattern changes entirely. And this kind of analysis, where it flips to the outside, it flips to the M25 and it goes inwards now, it can inform emergency response, planning as well as evacuation control. In the longer term, it can help prioritise the repair and reopening of movement corridors. And of course, similar principles apply to any major urban event and consequent evacuation, as they did in Christchurch in New Zealand following the earthquakes of 2011. Has anyone here been to Christchurch in the last few years? Quite a remarkable place where the very centre of the city was removed by the earthquakes. It was cordoned off, closed by the army for several years. And before the earthquakes here, it's that nexus of red routes and right in the middle of the slide. That's the CBD. It's where all the shops are, it's where the majority of businesses, the big businesses, are located. And overnight, it was gone. Then what happened, in order for Christchurch to adapt, or otherwise suffer catastrophic economic failure, people had to relocate. And I think two things are worth pointing out about how Christchurch did it. First is the connected grid layout, the legacy of history, pre-modern planning, when Christchurch was laid out like every other city in history as a continuously connected grid. It was essential to the city's survival because it created a choice of routes so that movement could immediately adapt to road closures. Contrast this with cities which have increasingly funneled their traffic onto a restricted set of major highways. If you lose one of those, chances are the whole might easily go down. So the continuously connected grid is in itself a resilient urban form. But secondly, the emergence of new centres. This one here, Stanmore Road, wasn't there before. You see it? Wasn't there. But because the middle of the spatial system was no longer accessible, movement was diverting around it. Stanmore Road was getting more natural through movement. And it's been fascinating to track the migration of business to Stanmore Road. It's emerged as a new urban centre. The issues it now faces are with the reopening of the city centre. Will it survive? Should it be subsidised? Or should it just be closed back down to what it was? If we think about cities in these resilient ways of having more than one life, we might be able to plan for contingencies in a more sophisticated way. Some contingencies are short-lived and they can seem random and chaotic. For example, the London riots in 2011 in August. And we looked at the time, indeed, we looked at this while the events were unfolding because we had access, as did everyone, to social media feeds, but especially The Guardian ran a verified riot incident analysis, which we were harvesting in real time, and geolocating. So we were using a geographic information system to pinpoint where these riot instances were emerging. And we then ran analytics to say, why is it happening where it's happening? And more importantly, why isn't it happening in some places? And not least because we were in the office. We wanted to know, should we send the staff home, or are we sending our staff home into more danger than where they currently are? So the first thing we did was to correlate those locations with the index of multiple deprivation, public available data. If you have a geographic information system, very easy to visualize. And there was a correlation. 84% of the locations where the rioting was occurring were in places which had a higher than average index of multiple deprivation. We could have stopped there, and I'm glad we didn't, because that's not good enough. Didn't explain those places where it wasn't happening. There were plenty of places that are deprived on this score, but weren't seeing rioting happening. So we dug a little deeper. We zoomed in on North London and South London, and we analysed it against spatial accessibility. And we found similar kind of proportion of those incidents, 84%, falling within 400 metres of an important street, a spatially accessible street measured by the space syntax algorithm. Again, useful, but there were spatially accessible streets with no rioting. So we then, and this I think is the controversial bit, we then brought in another kind of analysis, a little bit difficult to see on this image, but in black are those parts of the street network that are very fine scale, highly spatially dense, but not particularly accessible, i.e., in the main, 20th century housing estates. Very fine scale, very permeable, but not very accessible, because typically they've been built away from main streets without through movement. And 100% of the locations we looked at fell within 800 metres of both an accessible street and a housing estate. Now, precisely why this should be the case is open to speculation and to further research. It's the kind of work that we couldn't do live, but our colleagues are doing at UCL and other academic places. Is it because the rioters lived or socialised on these estates? Certainly Bill's work in Chapter 5 of the Space is the Machine, Can Architecture Cause Social Malaise, is an investigation into the different patterns of behaviour between 19th century street networks and 20th century housing estates, where he finds children not mixing with adults on housing estates. Children therefore growing up without adult supervision, intervention, however formal or informal. The speculation is that there is a socialisation process that goes on, whereby kids are growing up according to their own rule system. It's speculation, but it's the kind of speculation that can be provoked by this kind of analysis. Not everyone agreed with us. I'm sure not everyone in this room will be in agreement or even comfortable with these kind of results. But it does provoke questions that can then lead to further investigation. In drawing to a close over the next few minutes, I want to, I'm not going to have the opportunity to talk about the insides of buildings. To the urban design group, the insides of buildings, I don't know if they compute. Of course they do. But a lot of our work at Space Syntax is about the good stuff happening inside buildings, about where people meet, how people browse galleries like the Tate, the old Tate Gallery here, how they communicate in offices and share ideas, and how they can be looked after in hospitals more humanely. What we've done here on the left is follow 100 people for 10 minutes as they arrived at the entrance to the Tate at the bottom on the left. And then on the right, analysing the visibility patterns available from, not just from each room of the Tate, but from each half-metre by half-metre tile of space within each room. So you can produce a very fine-grained analysis that explains why, when people go to the Tate, they tend to head off to the left, why so few of them get over to the bottom right, which is where the Turners are. Best paintings in Britain, but potentially the least visited best paintings in Britain. and why the spatial layout of the Tate is culpable in the patterns of movement, co-presence that you encounter in that building. So let me, thinking of the future, try and summarize what we're doing at Space Syntax with Bill's work. We've built this company around the central idea of creating and then nurturing this concept of thriving life. I think however our clients and partners approach us, whether it's about the bad days or the good days, the idea is common to their interests. They want to engender thriving life. And then we wrap this idea in a process that has these two key characteristics. It's science-based and it's human-focused. It's not using science just for the sake of it. It's trying to bed it into the way people live, as Bill said at the beginning. And these are Bill's 4 words, actually, when I asked him to try and summarize Space Syntax in one sentence a couple of years ago. He did better than that. He said, well, 4 words, science-based, human-focused. And then there are 3 principal kinds of activity that we're engaged in. We apply the approach in practice. We develop it continuously to try and keep pace of change. And then we disseminate it. And that's possibly the most important one of the 3, the dissemination. It's where I'll end in a couple of minutes. First, a quick tour of the other 2, the apply and develop. We apply Space Syntax through the consulting company that helped with Trafalgar Square and many things since. And we've been advising, for example, on projects like Bloomberg, which just opened recently. And if you haven't had a chance yet to walk, I thoroughly recommend walking Watling Street, which is the route that passes through the heart of the Bloomberg estate, carves up that estate into very uncomfortable shaped buildings, the sort of thing that would have been laughed out of architecture school, possibly even urban design school. But we argued through a modelling process that if you introduce Watling Street, as you can see it, it's actually recreating something that was there throughout history. And it will benefit the site, it'll draw movement through it, it'll help the Bloomberg identity, but it'll also benefit the city around it. And since about 1998, we've been promoting Watling Street on this site with various architects, and Foster's managed to bring it home. The Space Syntax Studio leads and prepares designs for our clients, public and private sector, acting as a lead designer on projects small, like parks, or large, like entire cities. We're bringing together multidisciplinary teams and acting as the principal. And this is, for me, this maturing I referred to earlier. We can't just be the also quiet voice in the corner saying you really shouldn't have done that. We have to lead. We have to actually show what we think is the right way forward. As in China, landing a new monorail system right into the middle of a public square where it can engage and help justify the investment to turn what's currently a car park into a public space. At the heart of this is a project review process. Bill's very active in. Bill and I co-chair that. And everything I've just shown you is seen by that team from inception to completion. The development, bottom left, of Space Syntax, we don't stop. Has been incredibly tempting just to say to everyone, stop. Let's just have one technology and let's just do it well. But it doesn't keep pace with client interest. It doesn't keep pace with technological capability. It doesn't keep pace with data prevalence. So the laboratory engages in new research. The digital works in the continuous creation of new technologies. I'm going to whip through some research. But health, and health are 5 key subjects that we are currently very, very involved in, trying to understand loneliness and how it relates to car dependency and air quality, working with the Future Cities Catapult to do research and develop technologies to link data sets together, understanding walkability not just as a nice word, but as a must-have for urban development. access to GPs, not just in terms of their spatial location, but their quality. So by having public data sets on what people think about their local GP, geolocating them, and then looking at the accessibility and quality, we can give better kinds of advice to the policymakers who want to know what they should be opening and where, as with schools. Again, just a whip through. I just wanted to show you a couple of subjects. We can't do all of this alone, and we absolutely haven't ever and don't want to do that. We've always worked in partnership. The last part, the last third, is really, for me, the really important one, the dissemination of space syntax. And it's very important to Bill. We absolutely do not want to cling on to this. We want it to be in general practice. The fact it isn't, after a couple of decades of developing it, is a lingering regret, and it's something that we are working hard to make happen. We want it to be at the end of every pencil, and it's possible with development. And we don't just want it to be the software, we want it to be the theories, the methods, and the data. Brief history, we've been trying ever since I've known space syntax to make the theories accessible through books. One of my challenges in running the consultancy in the early 90s was that I discovered we had no IP. It had all been published by the academics. It was quite a nice problem. We didn't have any IP lawyers to pay. It was all out there. It was free. We just had to continue to develop it and be the leader. That's the imperative to us at Space Syntax. And then one of the first decisions we made with the software was to make it easier for people to get their hands on it, to be able to license it, rather than as was happening, there was a kind of a black market in floppy disks going, mostly happening at Oxford Brookes, I have to say. There's, villainous activities up there, which I'm very glad people did pirate the software. It made its way to South Africa. The Mandela Bridge in Johannesburg wouldn't have been built. Well, it may have been, but it was certainly helped by a presentation to Nelson Mandela with space syntax and justifying the route that was taken. Lots of other reasons, lots of politics, but there was a bit of science there as well. All done without our knowledge. So we said, let's formalize it, have the software, we want to know who you are. And then we started to do the same with our data sets. In 2009, a very, very important event happened, which is that we open sourced our software. So we made it not only possible to license it, but to hack it. Anyone to get their hands on it and do it themselves. This was a decision forced on us by Alistair Turner, who'd written the software, but who was dying. And it was his knowledge of his condition that made it necessary for him to create a cohort of developers who could continue his work after his death. And it was, if there is a silver lining, it was the best thing. And it was the real moment that we understood that open source was the way forward. Anyone who's proprietary about their software is going to face great cost, great expense to develop it themselves. And Alistair has given us a great legacy. Shortly afterwards, or about the same time, we published Space is the Machine online, Bill's book from '96, because we saw it trading on Amazon for about $250 a book. It was crazy. So, the first temptation is, I'm sure I've got a copy somewhere. I could flog that. Second temptation was to hire a graphic designer, build a website, publish the book, make sure that it was available for free, and just say, that's wrong. £250 for a book is wrong. That's when you have to break the chain, take it out the monastery, and make it available. So we've done that. That's great, publishing our theories, publishing our software, but what we hadn't published was our operating manual. And we realized, and we could see people using the software badly. So in 2015, we finally, having emerged from this horrible thing called the global financial crisis, had the funds with UCL to jointly publish the online training platform in Space Syntax, which gives away our secret sauce. And again, it's the most refreshing, revelatory, wonderful experience is to give it all away. So do take a look. Tell us what you think. We're very, very keen that we publish everything, at least once we know it works. And it's a very different and unusual way of doing business. We recognize that, but we're not the only ones in the tech world to be doing this. We're publishing in Chinese, principally as a language as well as English. We'll continue to publish in English because space syntax has really taken off in China. The demand from China is huge, and I think it may not be an exaggeration to say there are now more space syntax researchers in China than in the UK, possibly more in China than the rest of the world combined. This is the first space syntax conference in China 2 years ago. We didn't advertise it. 500 people turned up. And they're using space syntax in practice as well. More than ever, they need in China the operating manual to do it well. And the next International Space Syntax Symposium will be in Beijing in 2 years' time. I expect to see you all there with your papers, having downloaded the manual. We're giving training in China too. We've set up a business there to provide training, flying out from the UK, working with local partners. Recently trained the Changchun Institute of Urban Planning and Design. These are everyday local authority planners now armed with technology. We'll be out there in January to give them their second year of training. And just in case you didn't notice those blue words around the outside of the circle, I've dealt with bottom right, the open sourcing, bottom left, the open accessing of our information. The one at the top is, it matters very much to my colleagues and I, which is that we are now employee-owned. And again, part of Bill's openness and our general approach has been that from day one of your employment at Space Syntax, you're an owner. Nothing more day one. Is there a theoretical basis to this? Possibly. A city is not a tree. It's Chris Alexander. At least a city shouldn't be a tree. We've seen a few. A city should be a grid, and I think so with business. Not a single trunk, or even a few branches and a lot of twigs, but instead a multi-system, as Alexander said. So with business, a multi-system of many brains, encouraging reflective decision-making, not singular authority. Through being open, and this is the final piece, we're about to take a big step in 2018, which is we've made our core software open, we've made our methods open, we've made some of our data open, but we believe the way forward is to make everything open, and therefore free. We'll either kill our business or we will nurture and expand it rapidly. I choose the latter, but it'll only happen if we remain at the forefront. We have to keep developing, keep being the best at what we do. And with this in mind, I'm very pleased to announce today we'll soon be launching freely and openly this spatial layout model of central London, which has been the basis for the work that I've shown you from Trafalgar Square and on. This is Barnsbury, where Bill's original work began. It's been built with thousands of hours of researcher and consultant time. Millions of pounds of public and private money have been spent on it. We could have kept it to ourselves, but we think it's better to make it a public asset. We're not just going to restrict it, in fact, to central London. We're going to include the entirety of London in the data set within the north and south circular roads, and indeed beyond to include the whole of London within the M25. We've connected it to a model that was built with public funds of the whole of the southeast of England, and through some work that we did with the Government Office for Science to look at the future of cities across the UK, where I know some of us in the room were all involved. We've gone on to build a spatial model of England, of Wales, and of Scotland. We'll add Northern Ireland soon. And this will be a publicly available asset, free and open. As part of our dissemination, we want other people to have something that they probably won't be able to afford to create themselves. So why should they? And why are we doing it? Well, it's to place space and spatial analysis where we believe it belongs. Actually, rather where we can see science shows that it belongs, which is right at the heart of things. Thank you very much.